What made Jesus different from all the others teaching a similar message was the claim that he had been raised from the dead. Belief in Jesus' resurrection changed absolutely everything. Such a thing was not said of any of the other apocalyptic preachers of Jesus' day, and the fact that it was said about Jesus made him unique. The New Testament writers speak as if Christ's achievement in rising from the dead was the first event of its kind in the whole history of the universe. He is the firstfruits, the pioneer of life. He has forced open a door that has been locked since the death of the first man. He has met, fought, and beaten the king of death. Everything is different because he has done so. This is the beginning of the new creation. A new chapter in cosmic history has opened. No special tools of analysis are needed to understand the story of Jesus' crucifixion. Why? Because it's a story that already possesses the ingredients of plot conflict, sequence, setting, and characterization. In other words, the Gospels do not provide a single composite story of the crucifixion. Thus, we need to pay close attention to the story as we find it in the Gospels, as if we were reading it in real time. Thus, the first step in our analysis is to identify the units that belong to the crucifixion story. Since the concluding genre in the Gospels is the resurrection story, broadly defined to include post-resurrection appearances, it is best to include Jesus' death and burial under the umbrella of the crucifixion story. Since the Gospels give us snapshots of what happened at the crucifixion and burial of Jesus, and not a continuous narrative flow, we can ask the following questions. First, starting at an observational or descriptive level, what happens to Jesus? Second, who are the ones who are in control of the crucifixion at any given point? And what can we say about them? Third, who are the onlookers? Fourth, if we include all the people present, the soldiers who performed the crucifixion, the onlookers, and the two victims crucified beside Jesus, how do these divide into two opposed groups? In this case, tormentors of Jesus and sympathizers. What does each group contribute to the crucifixion story? Fifth, the writers of the Gospels are our travel guides through the books that they wrote. They use devices of disclosure that add up to interpretive commentary on the part of the author. Thus, upon closer scrutiny, what interpretation can we see intermingled with the factual account of what happened? What does each Gospel writer highlight for us? Sixth, it is a good reading strategy to imagine that you are present at the events narrated. Thus, how would you have reacted to what you saw and heard? With just the data of the Gospel accounts at your disposal, how much of the theological meaning of what was happening are you likely to have grasped? In other words, it is important to make sure that we do not bring our current analysis of what we do know about the theological significance of what happened on Calvary, also from prophetic parts of the Bible, including Jesus' foretelling statements. Thus, if we were reading it in real time, we would not understand a great deal on that day than we do now, as part of our current familiarity with the Bible. Once we fully reflect on these questions, especially the sixth question, we can then realize that the story of Jesus' crucifixion should be the saddest story in the world. But it is more than that. In other words, a paradox lies at the heart of this story. And J.R.R. Tolkien has given us the word eucatastrophe to name this paradox, meaning a good catastrophe. Thus, since Jesus' crucifixion should be considered the most evil event in history, instead it secured the redemption of those who believe in Jesus' substitutionary atonement for their salvation. When we think of the devastating blow the crucifixion was for the earliest followers of Jesus, how can we rightly describe their experience as suddenly being convinced that Jesus was alive, risen from the dead? The answer would naturally be eucatastrophe. This was truly a sudden happy turn that pierced the depths of their being, bringing tears of joy and wonder, and we witnessed this unexpected joy and wonder in their responses to the risen Jesus in the resurrection stories. Jeffrey Morris says, quote, Tolkien believed that this form of human creativity reflected divine creativity, and was hence a function of our being created in the image of God. The highest form of this myth-making is the quote-unquote eucatastrophe, the sudden unexpected joy when all appears lost. As he explains, the good catastrophe, the sudden joy's turn, it is a sudden and miraculous grace. He is quick to point out that the eucatastrophe does not deny the existence of dicatastrophe, of sorrow and failure. It denies universal defeat. It is in Tolkien's application of this to Christianity that we find his largest influence on C.S. Lewis, arguably the greatest Christian apologist of the 20th century, converted to Christianity in large part because of his discussions with Tolkien. The other major influences being J.K. Chesterton's The Everlasting Man, Owen Barfield's discussions, Hugo Dyson's conversations, and the positive responses of skeptical colleagues to Christian claims. The influence of Tolkien on Lewis can be gauged by the fact that Lewis dedicated his famous book, The Screwtape Letters, to Tolkien. While a professor, Tolkien formed a club, which Lewis joined, where they would read Icelandic sagas. Tolkien and Lewis thus became great friends and ended up forming the renowned Inklings. Tolkien had such a decisive influence on Lewis's conversion to Christianity that Pierce has gone so far as to suggest that, quote, without Tolkien, there might not have been C.S. Lewis, at least not the C.S. Lewis that has come to be known and loved throughout the world as a formidable Christian apologist. What Tolkien, along with Hugo Dyson, did for Lewis was to explain that Christianity had many of the characteristics of other myths. Only it was a true myth. Christianity was a myth that entered the actual world. It entered history. As Tolkien elegantly wrote, quote, the Gospels contain a fairy story, or a story of a larger kind which embraces all the essence of fairy stories. They contain many marvels, peculiarly artistic, beautiful, and moving, mythical in their perfect, self-contained significance. And among the marvels is the greatest and most complete conceivable eucatastrophe. But this story has entered history and the primary world. The desire and aspiration of sub-creation has been raised to the fulfillment of creation. The birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history. The resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation. It has the preeminently inner consistency of reality. There is no tale ever told that men would rather find was true, and none which so many skeptical men have accepted as true on its own merits. To reject it leads to either sadness or wrath. Thus, since we are focused on the bedrock facts from the earliest sources, in this case Paul's undisputed letters, technically we do not need to look in detail at the resurrection accounts within the Gospels. However, we do want to visit the earliest followers of Jesus on the night of Jesus' crucifixion. In other words, it is the unanimous testimony of the Gospels and one of the many bedrock facts from the Gospels that on the night before the crucifixion, the night Jesus was arrested, Judas betrayed Jesus, Peter denied him, and the rest of his disciples fled. All abandoned Jesus. Ehrman says, quote, Jesus was evidently arrested by Jewish authorities in the Garden of Gethsemane. The disciples may have tried to defend him with swords. This doesn't seem like a tradition the later pacifist Christians would invent. But they then abandoned him, as all of our traditions suggest. In independent sources, Peter is said to have denied knowing Jesus 3 times, another tradition that may pass the criterion of dissimilarity. What is abundantly clear is that at the end, no one stood up for or put his or her neck out for Jesus. He was tried and executed alone. Thus, let's time travel to this very night in Jerusalem, to interact with Jesus' disciples in hiding. Whether they were all together or scattered in different places throughout Jerusalem, we do not know. But what we do know is that all their hopes and dreams of Jesus as the Messiah had been crushed. The crucifixion of Jesus, their leader, was a death blow to their movement, since it was also an ironic reminder and repetition of many other failed messianic movements. In other words, a crucified Messiah was a contradiction in Second Temple Judaism, that a dead, crucified Messiah was no Messiah at all. Notice their psychological programming at this point in time. They had followed this extraordinary man for roughly 3 years, and now he was dead. Thus, what emotions flowed through their minds? Were they sad for him, weeping floods of tears for their dead master? Or were they angry, enraged at Jesus for leading them astray all these years? Chrysostom, 4th century bishop of Constantinople, concludes that the latter is more likely, that the apostles had negative, enraged, bitter mindset toward Jesus. Quote, "For that the gospel is divine, even from hence is evident, namely, whence could it have occurred to 12 ignorant men to attempt such great things? Who sojourned in marshes, in rivers, in deserts? Who never at any time perhaps had entered into a city nor into a forum? Whence did it occur to set themselves in array against the whole world? For that they were timid and unmanly, he shews who wrote of them, not apologizing, nor enduring to throw their failings into the shade, which indeed of itself is a very great token of the truth. What then doth he say about them? That when Christ was apprehended, after 10,000 wonders, they fled, and he who remained, being the leader of the rest, denied. Whence was it then that they who, when Christ was alive, endured not the attack of the Jews, now that he was dead and buried, as ye say, had not risen again, nor had any talk with them, nor infused courage into them, whence did they set themselves in array against so great a world? Would they not have said among themselves, What meaneth this? Himself he was not able to save, and will he protect us? Himself he defended not when alive, and will he stretch out the hand unto us now that he is dead? Himself when alive subdued not even one nation, and are we to convince the whole world by uttering his name? How, I ask, could all this be reasonable? I will not say, as something to be done, but even as something to be imagined, from whence it is plain that had they not seen him after he was risen, and received most ample proof of his power, they would not have ventured so great a cast. Thus, what we can say with historical certainty as a bedrock fact is that sometime very soon after this, on the third day after the crucifixion, these same overwhelmingly devastated followers were suddenly convinced that their crucified leader had risen from the dead. This is the next line in the creedal tradition. Quote, "He was buried, he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and is still alive." Wright says, quote, "One final point at this stage. Goulder questions which scripture should be meant by, quote, according to the scriptures in 1 Corinthians 15 verse 4, and suggests as, quote, the best candidate from a weak field. This is a complete misunderstanding. Paul does not mean that there are one or two biblical prophecies which, taken by themselves, point in this direction. He refers to the entire scriptural narrative stretching forward as it does toward the climax of God's purpose for Israel, and characterized throughout by the powerful grace which brings hope out of disaster and life out of death. Furthermore, and most importantly, the creedal tradition used the Greek aorist tense for both, quote, the Messiah died, and, quote, he was buried. But the Greek perfect tense is used in, quote, he was raised. In other words, verse 4 is most accurately translated in the International Standard Version, the ISV, as, quote, he was buried, he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and is still alive. David Black explains why this translation is accurate. Quote, in the New Testament, the genius of the Greek perfect is clearly seen in 1 Corinthians 15 verse 4, where Paul uses the perfect tense, quote, Christ was raised, to emphasize that the risen Christ remains in a state of risenness, in contrast to his death and subsequent burial and appearances. Aorist are used to describe these actions. Sometimes the Greek perfect passive has to be translated by the English simple past, quote, Christ died, the aorist active, and was raised, the perfect passive. Here, however, the perfect, quote, was raised, contains the further thought, quote, and is still alive today. Wright also says, quote, the verb is actually perfect, not, as most translations imply, aorist. Quote, he was raised, matching, quote, died, quote, was buried, and, quote, was seen. The Greek perfect tense indicates the ongoing result of a one-off event. In this case, the permanent result that Jesus is now the risen Messiah and Lord. The verb, like the others here, is passive, indicating divine action. Paul regularly sees the resurrection of Jesus as a great act of the Creator himself. Like the scriptural narrative invoked as the world of meaning for, quote, the Messiah died for our sins, the qualifying phrase here looks back to the scriptural narrative as a whole, not simply to a handful of proof texts. And the point Paul has in mind within that longer scriptural narrative is the point at which Yahweh forgives Israel's sins, ushering in the new age, renewing the covenant, restoring creation, and raising his people from the dead. Ezekiel 37 is important here, but so too, most would agree, is Hosea 6 verse 2. Whatever its original meaning, the signs are that by Paul's day, this passage was being read in terms both of resurrection itself, quote, after 3 days, and of the restoration of Israel after sin. Paul seems to intend both of these meanings, and indeed, they belong closely with each other. Thus, since Jesus' earliest followers, soon after his death, became convinced that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to them, is, like the crucifixion, as historical as anything can ever be. But a critical question that should be asked is this. Assuming that Jesus remained dead and did not appear to them, where did they get this idea of their crucified leader rising from the dead? Could they ever have conceived of the idea of resurrection before he appeared to them? First, it is true that many Second Temple Jews believed in a future bodily resurrection. In fact, they expected a Davidic Messiah figure to arrive and rescue them from their pagan oppressors. But not one of them envisioned a two-stage resurrection in which the Messiah would die and be resurrected first, and then the general resurrection would take place at the end of this present age, let alone a Messiah that would be crucified by their pagan oppressors. Wright says, quote, "But nobody imagined that any individuals had already been raised, or would be raised in advance of the great last day. There are no traditions about prophets being raised to new bodily life. The closest we come to that is Elijah, who had gone bodily to heaven and would return to herald the new age. There are no traditions about a Messiah being raised to life. Most Jews of this period hope for resurrection. Many Jews of this period hope for a Messiah, but nobody put those two hopes together until the early Christians did so. It may be obvious, but it needs saying. However exalted Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob may have been in Jewish thought, nobody imagined they had been raised from the dead. However important Moses, David, Elijah, and the prophets may have been, nobody claimed that they were alive again in the quote-unquote resurrection sense. The martyrs were honored, venerated even, but nobody said they had been raised from the dead. The world of Judaism had generated from its rich scriptural origins a rich variety of beliefs about what happened and would happen to the dead. But it was quite unprepared for the new mutation that sprang up like a totally unexpected plant within the already well-stocked garden. Thus, the historian is pressed for an explanation for this unparalleled innovation among these Second Temple Jewish Nazarenes. If Jesus did not appear to them, then where did these ideas come from? From the mind of Peter, Mary Magdalene, James? Their claims concerning Jesus were unique not only in the history of Judaism, but in the history of ideas in general. It is crucial to understand the large-scale context for understanding how innovative this theology is. In other words, understanding the creative, intelligent methodology in how God, over the course of Old Testament history, designed his plan of redemption, he did it secretly. We see this theme play out throughout Scripture. For example, John speaks about future events in the Apocalypse as, quote, "When the time approaches for the seventh angel to blow his trumpet, God's secret plan will be fulfilled, as he had announced to his servants the prophets." God has hidden purposes to overcome the wicked and vindicate the righteous. God's secret purposes were understood to include the rise and fall of earthly kingdoms, and the establishment of his kingdom at the end of time. Similarly, John assumes that God's secret purpose will culminate in the coming of the kingdom, the rewarding of the righteous, and the final defeat of the powers of evil. This purpose will be complete when the prophets have finished their work. God's wrath has been poured out, and the reign of the beast has ended. In its full sense, completion occurs after the vision of the millennial kingdom. When Satan is destroyed, the New Jerusalem appears, and God and Jesus announce that they are the end or completion of all things. Thus, the secret is announced to his servants, the prophets. On one level, these are the biblical prophets. On another level, the prophets include Christian prophets like John, who stand within the prophetic tradition while continuing to receive and convey God's message. John's language recalls what Amos said, that, quote, "Truly, the Lord God will do nothing he has mentioned without revealing his purposes to his servants the prophets." However, instead of saying that God has revealed his quote-unquote secret to the prophets, John says that he, quote-unquote, announced it to them. This wording leaves open the possibility that the prophets did not have the full meaning of the message. This is the view of Second Temple theology, that when God communicated to the prophets, they were mysteries that were not fully understood until the time of their fulfillment. For example, from Qumran we read, quote, "Then God told Habakkuk to write down what is going to happen to the generation to come. But when that period would be complete, he did not make known to them." When it says, "so that with ease someone can read it," this refers to the teacher of righteousness to whom God made known all the mysterious revelations of his servants the prophets. For still the prophecy is for a specific period. It testifies of that time and does not deceive. This means that the last days will be long, much longer than the prophets have said. For God's revelations are truly mysterious. Thus, John is more of a prophet than a teacher, though his role is similar to that of the teacher of righteousness, since John also discloses the fuller meaning of what was conveyed through the biblical prophets. In other words, the completion of the secret is the conclusion of God's plan that was initiated before the foundation of the world and is now finally to be realized in its fullness. Using the terms of Jesus in the Gospels, God's kingdom, inaugurated in the first advent, is about to be culminated in the second advent. Likewise, these theological conclusions also appear elsewhere in the New Testament, where Paul claimed that God enabled Christians to understand, quote, God's wisdom in a hidden secret, which had been concealed for ages, but was now revealed to those who had received the Holy Spirit. But why did God do it this way? The answer goes right back to the start of the biblical epic. Ever since the disruption of Eden, God has been at work to use men and women to restore the original vision. The most visible manifestation of that effort was the creation of a new family through Abraham and Sarah, Israel. However, Israel failed miserably in its mission, from the incomplete conquest of the Nephilim, to the splintering of the unity of its 12 tribes, to the collapse of the Davidic dynasty into exile in Babylon. Babylon was the place that God had decided to disinherit the nations and create his own people millennia earlier. The apostasy of his people and their subsequent exile prompted a change in God's approach to restoring his rule on earth. He could not depend on humans, though he had pledged himself to humanity's preservation. He would no more forego the role of his human images than he would destroy them. Because his original creation of humanity as his image had meant free will agency, his kingdom must of necessity include humanity in its recovery and in rulership. Otherwise, the Edenic vision would be undermined. There could be only one solution, though it would have two strategic deployments. First, God understood that only he could be trusted with perfectly accomplishing his own will. Thus, he would have to become human and inhabit the hearts of his children. Residing in a temple was not enough. He had to indwell those who chose to follow him. And second, God announced in the days before the southern kingdom of Judah fell to Babylon that, though the kingdom of Judah would be destroyed, he was making a new covenant with his people. God would send his Spirit to indwell his people. They could not be trusted with their freedom, but he would not eradicate it, nor would he leave them without enablement. However, the first strategy is much more cryptic, and is the basis for why it is referred to as, quote, God's secret plan. As Christians, we instinctively think about Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah when we view this through the first strategy of God becoming a human. In other words, thoughts of Jesus naturally flow through our mind when we read the Old Testament. But that is because we have the New Testament as hindsight. Israelites and Jews in exile had no such thing. But the disconnection is much deeper than this. In other words, it is by God's design that the Scriptures present the Messiah in terms of a mosaic profile that can only be discerned after the pieces are assembled. Paul tells us why, that though, quote, we speak about God's wisdom in a hidden secret, which God destined before the world began for our glory, none of the rulers of this world understood it, because if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Thus, if the plan of God for the Messiah's mission had been clear, the powers of darkness would never have killed Jesus. They would have known that his death and resurrection would be the key to reclaiming the nations forever. Thus, the Old Testament profile of the Messiah was deliberately veiled. Why? Because since the Hebrew word Mashiach, or Messiah, occurs over 40 times in the Old Testament, it simply means, quote, anointed. Many people were, quote unquote, anointed in the Old Testament, particularly kings, but many of those were unscrupulous or incompetent. The word occurs with reference to a deliverer whose appearance would be future to the Old Testament era in only a handful of places, and some of those are not clear as to whether the anointed is even a follower of God. For example, in Psalm 2 verse 2 we see the mention of the quote-unquote kings of the earth, and this would likely have been taken by a Jew living in the Old Testament era as referring to a time in the distant future. Another example is Daniel 9 verses 25 to 26, and how far into the future Jewish reader may have placed it depends on when it was written. A good case can be made for the passage being fulfilled in the Second Temple period, and a yet future time. It is not clear whether the passage refers to one, quote-unquote, anointed prince, or two, whether good or evil. Again, in another example, the fact that Cyrus the Persian, a pagan, could be called Mashiach by God illustrates the flexibility and ambiguity of the concept. Thus, there is no single verse in the Old Testament that contains the word Mashiach that one could then use to discern the future scope of what Jesus did in the New Testament. In fact, there is no Old Testament verse that has a dying and rising Mashiach. Christians automatically think of Isaiah 53 as the exception, but it is not. The word Mashiach does not appear in that passage. That does not mean Isaiah 53 is not part of the messianic profile. It means that the content of Isaiah 53 is just one piece of a much larger whole. The pieces were kept separate to obscure the big picture. This sheds light on certain episodes in the New Testament, such as why Peter could not grasp the notions of Jesus going up to Jerusalem to die. Peter believed Jesus was the Messiah. When Jesus announced he was going to die in Jerusalem, Peter did not say, I know, I read that in my Bible. He could not read it in his Bible because there was no single verse for the idea. Rather, the concept of a dying and rising Messiah must be pieced together from a scattering of fragments in the Old Testament, where each taken alone does not have anything like a dying and rising Messiah in mind. None of the fragments reveal the final assemblage. Even after the resurrection, the disciples had to have their minds supernaturally open to see a suffering Messiah. The point is straightforward. Only someone who knew the outcome of the puzzle, who knew how all the elements of the messianic mosaic would come together, could make sense of the pieces. Jesus had to enable the disciples to understand what the Old Testament was simultaneously hiding and revealing. It was not a matter of reading one verse here and there. Unfortunately, most Christians today do not understand the complexity that Luke 24 verses 45 reveals. Instead, they repeatedly hear the New Testament read back into the Old Testament. That is unfortunate, since this makes Old Testament passages say things that no New Testament writer ever quoted them as saying. For example, Genesis 3:15 is a verse where God told the Shining One that his offspring would bruise the heel of Eve's offspring, and that Eve's offspring would bruise his head. This is often taken as evidence for a suffering and dying Messiah and his victory over the forces of evil through the resurrection. But that is not how the New Testament cites the passage. The verse is indeed alluded to by Paul in Romans 16 verse 20, where he mentions the prospect of the serpent being crushed, and not just his head. But the crushing is not performed by Jesus, the son of Eve and resurrected Messiah. Rather, Paul has God crushing the serpent under the feet of Christians. Another example is the account of Abraham's sacrificial offering of Isaac. Notice that the New Testament never cites the story as a picture of either the crucifixion or resurrection. Instead, Paul gives a subtle nuance by saying that though Isaac did not die in the incident, quote, Abraham was certain that God could raise the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did get Isaac back in this way. These Old Testament passages have been made by modern commentators to speak about the Messiah and his work in ways the New Testament authors do not claim. We should not create connections where the biblical text does not. Instead, we need to think more carefully about what we do find in the text. God's plan to redeem humanity, reclaim the nations, and revive Eden depended on the incarnation of the second Yahweh and his subsequent death and resurrection. The story of the cross is the biblical theological catalyst to God's plan for regaining all that was lost in Eden. It could not be emblazoned across the Old Testament in transparent statements. It had to be expressed in sophisticated and cryptic ways to ensure that the powers of darkness would be misled. The end result was that they were. Even the righteous angels did not know the plan. Why? Because God trusts no one. As Eliphaz told Job, quote, God doesn't trust his holy ones. Why? Because the members of God's divine council are corruptible. They are not perfect. As was again told to Job, quote, he doesn't trust his servants since he charges his angels with error. This should not be a profound idea, because it makes sense. In other words, the only truly perfect being is God. Thus, the only person the Father can trust is his own Son, because by theological implication, the Son is co-eternal with the Father. Hesychius of Jerusalem in the 5th century writes, quote, in truth, to be faultless is not easy for human beings. Faultlessness is beyond human possibilities. The order of the angels is itself subject to such weakness. This is what Eliphaz says. Even in his servants God puts no trust. It is evident that God puts no trust in the righteous, like you, who have trusted yourself, because he knows the weakness of their nature and how easily their flesh falls. The fallen angels give God a reason not to trust in them, those whom he charges with error. He has driven them away from the former honor of their rank, and has reduced them to a lower position because they had evil thoughts against God. But if it is so for them, who even though they have a weak nature, live nonetheless in the heights among the virtuous powers, and if it is so for angels who in their own nature were above us, what will we say about our own human condition, one even more subject to sin? Olympiodorus in the 6th century also says, quote, who is the person, Eliphaz asks, who can be blameless or can proclaim, I am righteous? If in fact those who are very holy, both men and angels, and the purity itself of heaven before the judgment of the most pure God appear to be unclean, what should we say about the damnable and impure human being who drinks iniquity like a drought? He has said this because humans commit sin deliberately. The words, as he does not trust his saints, may also be interpreted in this manner, since the angels themselves can become different in their nature. And actually some of them slipped away from their own former position. Heaven is not pure because of this, and it is also often obscured by clouds. Thus, how was God's secret plan of the Messiah cryptically designed? The first example is Adam. The obvious description of his role and identity is that he is the first archetypal high priest in Eden. Adam was the son of God. Thus, as a son of the king, in this case God, he was royalty. In fact, Second Temple texts are extensive in regards to the kingship of Adam, since it is an important part of Jewish messianic expectations prior to the time of Jesus. Thus, Adam was God's designated ruler in Eden. He was put in the garden to work and guard the land. Once expelled from the garden, he was displaced from God's kingdom to suffer, and work became a difficult drudgery. Thus, Adam lost his potential immortality and died. However, his lineage lived on, precariously through Noah, Abraham, Israel, and finally Jesus. Thus, his eternal life is guaranteed by God's power, but his bodily return to the new Eden depends on the resurrection of Jesus. Here is the resume of Adam. So you see him starting as son of God, then he's ruler king, he governs in God's place, he's a servant, he suffers, which is the effect of sin, then there's exile and death, he ceases to exist on earth, but he will live on through descendants, and this means that the resurrection is contingent for that to be possible. The second example is Israel. In terms of descent, Israelites trace their heritage back to Adam. But a closer examination of the nation's story produces remarkable similarities to Adam's profile. God calls the nation his son. Israel is not only the light to the nations, but God intended Israel to rule over the nations. This only makes sense given that God is ruler of the nations, and Israel is his son. Thus, this vision will be tied to the messianic heir of David. Israel corporately is referred to as God's servant. Like Adam, Israel's transgressions lead to exile from the place where the divine presence resided. In fact, Israel is compared to Adam. The result is suffering many times over under foreign powers and wicked kings. Eventually, Israel is exiled and ceases to exist as a nation. But the prophets foretold Israel's resurrection, most vividly through the vision of the dry bones. The nation is reborn after the exile in the form of the returning inhabitants of Judah from Babylon. Here is the resume of Israel. So Israel is the son of God, highest among nations, so Israel's king is most high. Israel is a servant, Israel suffers the effect of sin, exile and death, ceases to exist on earth. But Israel will live on through Judah. Again, a resurrection contingent on this context. The third example is Moses. As a believing Israelite, he was a son of Abraham, and ultimately God. His status in that regard was special, since he was God's appointed deliverer, ruler of the nation. God tells him that he will be God to Pharaoh. Thus, it would be through Moses that God's signs and wonders would be wielded against Egypt. Since he was a leader that had divine power, he would naturally be seen by the Israelites as a quasi-divine figure. Moses is called the servant of God. He suffers for his sin and is prohibited from entering the promised land. Though God permits him to see it from a distance before his death, the Transfiguration informs us that Moses lived on with God. But, as with everyone, his resurrection in a new Eden was contingent on the one who was to come. Here is the resume of Moses. So Moses is a son of God, ruler king over God's people. He's a servant. He suffers the effect of sin. Exile and death ceases to exist on earth, and he lives on with God. Again, resurrection contingent in this context. Finally, the fourth example is Israel's messianic king. God had promised David an everlasting dynastic succession. The fulfillment of this promise would fail in the Old Testament era due to the death of Israel in exile. But Israel's resurrection through Judah, which is David's tribe, would keep that promise alive. The fulfillment of the promise would be inaugurated at the first coming of Jesus, the second Yahweh incarnate. Thus, from this perspective, the consummation of the promise is yet future. But how do the patterns emerge in Davidic kingship and the messianic son of David? Like Moses and all believing Israelites, David was an earthly son of God. But we learn from certain psalms that the kings of David's line were also called a son of God, in an act of anointed adoption specific to the enthroned king. The king was God's anointed descendant of Judah, and his ruling was representative among all his earthly children. As with Moses, the kingship, by virtue of this adoptive language, carried with it a quasi-divine aspect. In fact, Psalm 89 verse 27 casts the throne of David as the, quote, highest among all the nations. The ultimate son of David would be a prophet like Moses. Not only were Adam, Moses, and Israel corporately God's servant, but David was also God's servant, as were other godly kings. One particular offshoot from the tribe of Judah and David's line would be the individual servant God would use to bring salvation to Israel. Like the corporate servant Israel, this individual servant would suffer and die. However, he will live to see his offspring, and a multitude made righteous by his service. The identity and purpose of the Messiah was unknowable from any single Bible verse. The profile proceeds along conceptual trajectories that eventually merge into a portrait. Here is the resume of the final King Messiah. That he's the Son of God, he's a ruler king, he represents David and Israel, ruler of God's people and all the nations. He's a servant because he represents Israel. He redeems Israel, which was the failed servant. He suffers, but he suffers the effect of sin on behalf of others, Israel's as well as all the nations. He is exiled and put to death. In other words, he ceases to exist on earth. But he's also resurrected by the power and plan of God. And all who are his, from Israel and all the nations, will now rise and rule with him. Thus, the question Jesus gave to the two men on the road to Emmaus makes perfect sense. The Messiah had to suffer these things and then enter his glory, didn't he? In comparison to the Greco-Roman context, they knew enough about the idea of resurrection to deny it. The lack of belief in or even outright rejection of resurrection is found in many Greek and Roman writers, especially Homer and Plato. We see this clearly when Paul proclaims the resurrection of Jesus to the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers, and they mock him. Another famous example comes from the Greek playwright Aeschylus, quote, "O monsters utterly loathed and detested by the gods! Zeus could undo fetters. There is a remedy for that, and many means of release. But when the dust has drawn up the blood of a man, once he is dead, there is no resurrection." On the other hand, according to Josephus, many Jews at the time, like the Pharisees, believed in a future bodily resurrection at the revolution of the ages, when the souls of the righteous, quote, return to find in chaste bodies a new habitation. Other Jews, such as Philo of Alexandria, opted more for the Greek idea of the immortality of the soul, and some, such as the Sadducees, denied any afterlife at all. Those who believed in resurrection primarily based it on this passage from Daniel, that, quote, many of those who are sleeping in the dust of the earth will awaken, some to life everlasting, and some to disgrace and everlasting contempt. Those who manifest wisdom will shine like the brightness of the expanse of heaven, and those who turn many to righteousness will shine like the stars forever and ever. In other words, this is about a literal, physical, bodily resurrection of the righteous and the unrighteous, or the physical revivification of bodies in a future renewed creation. There was no place in Jewish understanding for resurrection understood as the post-death existence of disembodied souls. Jonathan Edwards, an 18th century theologian, wrote, "It is a good argument for Christ's divinity that he is to be the author of the resurrection. The atoms and particles in one little finger are capable of so many removes and such dispersions that I believe it would surpass any finite understanding at 2,000 or 3,000 years' end to tell what distinct particles of the universe belong to it. It would require a vast strength and subtlety of mind to trace but one atom so nicely as to know that individual atom in the universe, after so long a time, after it had been a particle of air, water, oil, or animal spirit, and so on, and had been transported with prodigious swiftness from place to place, backwards and forwards, millions of times, amongst innumerable others of the same kind. Especially would it be exceeding difficult so narrowly to watch two of such at once. If so, what would it be to follow every atom in a man's body, yea, of all the bodies that ever have died or shall die, and at the same time to have the mind exercised with full vigor upon innumerable other matters that require an equal strength of understanding, and all this with such ease that it shall be no labor to the mind?" Dale Allison also says, quote, "As an historian reading my Bible, I am convinced that its texts about resurrection are about bones, flesh, and graves, which means they are about material continuity. The prophecy in Daniel 12 has it that many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake. Matthew 27 preserves the bizarre tradition that when Jesus died, the earth shook and the rocks were split. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. After his resurrection, they came out of the tombs and entered the holy city and appeared to many. In John 5, Jesus avows that the hour is coming when all who are in their graves will hear his voice and will come out. And of course, Jesus' resurrection leaves his burial cave empty. Even Paul's seed metaphor in 1 Corinthians 15 Even Paul's seed metaphor in 1 Corinthians 15 assumes some bodily continuity, although the apostle stresses differences between what he calls flesh and blood and spiritual bodies. To my knowledge, nowhere in the Bible or in Old Testament nowhere in the Bible or in old Jewish or Christian literature does the language of resurrection refer to a materially new body, physically unconnected to the old. A resurrected body is always the old body, or a piece of it, come back to life and or transformed. It does not surprise me that early Christians worried about cannibalism, which pagan detractors thought a refutation of Christian doctrine. Resurrection meant bodies in the ground coming back to life. To rise from the dead was to rise from one's tomb. We see this resurrection hope most clearly expressed in the records of the Maccabean martyrs killed during the 2nd century BC. Quote, "Now it came about that 7 brothers with their mother were also arrested. forced by the king to taste of the unlawful swine flesh and being tortured with whips and cords. One of them, acting as representative, said, "Do you intend to ask and learn from us? For we are prepared to die rather than transgress the laws of our fathers." Then, becoming angry, the king commanded some to heat pans and cauldrons. And as soon as they were heated, he commanded some to cut out the tongue of the one who was their representative, and, after scalping him, to cut off his hands and feet while the rest of the brothers and his mother were watching. After rendering him incapacitated for the remainder, the king commanded some to bring him still alive to the fire and to fry him in the pan. And as the vapor from the pan was giving widely, they were exhorting one another together with their mother to die bravely, speaking thusly, "The Lord God is watching and truly is compassionate to us, just as Moses made clear through the song of witness against the people to their face, saying, and to his servants he will be compassionate." Now, after the first died in this way, they brought the second for mocking, and, tearing away the skin of his head with his hair, they began asking, "Will you eat rather than have your body be punished limb by limb?" But answering in the language of his fathers, he said, "No. Therefore, even this one received the next torment like the first." But when he came to his last breath, he said, "You demon, you remove us out of the present life, but the King of the universe will raise us, because we die on account of his laws, to an eternal resurrection of life." Then after this they began abusing the third one, and, being ordered, he thrust out his tongue quickly and boldly stretched out his hands. And nobly he said, "I received these from heaven, an account of his laws, I disregard them, and from him I hope to receive them again." Therefore the king himself and those with him were amazed at the spirit of the young man, that he made his sufferings as nothing. Now after this one died, they tormented also the fourth, torturing him in the same way. And being near to death, he said to the following, "Those who die as a choice by humans accept from God the hope to be raised up again by him, but there will not be a resurrection to life for you." Thus, even if their tongues were cut out, or if their arms were cut off, these bold Maccabean martyrs believed that they will receive them back again at the resurrection. This is an example of resurrection hope during the Second Temple period. Notice that it involves only a future resurrection of bodies in the renewed creation. This is what resurrection meant to the Second Temple Jews who believed in it, as well as to those who denied it. Thus, the fervor of messianic expectation reached a boiling point in the first century. Many Jews were eagerly expecting the arrival of the Messiah, or even multiple Messiahs. Sigmund Mowinckel wrote, quote, "The word expresses an idea characteristic of later Judaism and early Christianity. In the time of Jesus, the Jews were awaiting a Messiah, and it was part of the message of Jesus, and later the central point in the teaching of his disciples, that he was this Messiah, he that cometh. Jesus, Messiah, or in Greek, Jesus Christ, were his name and his title in the speech of the community, until the term Christ also came to be regarded as a personal name. In order, therefore, to understand the consciousness and the message of Jesus, it is necessary to have as a background some idea of the messianic conceptions of his time. In later Judaism, the term Messiah denotes an eschatological figure. He belongs to the last time. His advent lies in the future. To use the word Messiah is to imply eschatology, the last things. It is therefore a misuse of the words Messiah and messianic, to apply them, for instance, to those ideas which were associated in Israel or in the ancient East with kings who were actually reigning. even if, as we shall see, these ideas were expressed in exalted and mythical terms. The word Messiah by itself, as a title and a name, originated in later Judaism as a designation of an eschatological figure, and it is therefore only to such a figure that it may be applied. In Christian eschatology too, the Messiah, or in this case Christ, became the central figure in the expectation of the last time. The expected day of judgment became the day of our Lord Jesus Christ. That is why theologians have sometimes used the expressions messianic prophecies or messianic expectations as synonymous with eschatological expectations. Similar to beliefs about resurrection and the afterlife, messianic expectations were incredibly diverse among first century Jews. For example, the Essenes expected at least two messiahs, a priestly messiah like Aaron and a kingly messiah like David. Quote, "When united by all these precepts, such men as these come to be a community in Israel, they shall establish eternal truth guided by the instruction of his Holy Spirit. They shall atone for the guilt of transgression and the rebellion of sin, becoming an acceptable sacrifice for the land through the flesh of burnt offerings, the fat of sacrificial portions, and prayer, becoming, as it were, justice itself, a sweet savour of righteousness and blameless behavior, a pleasing free will offering. At that time the men of the Yahad shall withdraw the holy house of Aaron, uniting as a holy of holies, and the synagogue of Israel as though who walk blamelessly. The sons of Aaron alone shall have authority in judicial and financial matters. They shall decide on governing precepts for the men of the Yahad and on money matters for the holy men who walk blamelessly. Their wealth is not to be admixed with that of rebellious men who have failed to cleanse their paths by separating from perversity and walking blamelessly. They shall deviate from none of the teachings of the law, whereby they walk in their willful heart completely. They shall govern themselves using the original precepts by which the men of the Yahad began to be instructed, doing so until there come the prophet and the messiahs of Aaron and Israel." But this isn't the only example from the Qumran community's collection of messianic prophecies. Another, more striking example describes a banquet in which all Israel will take part in the last days. The feast is associated with the arrival of the Messiah of Israel and is comparable with the early Christian agape or love feast. These Christian meals were attached to the sacrament of communion. We read in the New Testament and other early Christian literature of disorderly behavior associated with these meals. Thus, the strict regulation of the banquet described here finds a context. The connection of the meal here to the arrival of the Messiah further recalls Christian imagery of the marriage supper of the Lamb, the great banquet at which believers are said to join Jesus after all evil has been vanquished. But even more remarkable is that this text describes God's fathering of the Messiah of Israel, that is, of the war leader who was to arise from the line of David. The Hebrew verb used here is the same verb used in the biblical begetting passages. Thus, this Qumran text is describing a messianic figure who is, in a special way, a son of God. The notion that a Messiah would be such is, of course, an idea held in common with early Christianity. The text reads, quote, "The procedure for the meeting of the men of reputation when they are called to the banquet held by the party of the Yahad, when God has fathered the Messiah, or when the Messiah has been revealed, among them, the priest, as head of the entire congregation of Israel, shall enter first, trailed by all his brothers, the sons of Aaron, those priests appointed to the banquet of the men of reputation. They are to sit before him by rank. Then the Messiah of Israel may enter, and the heads of the thousands of Israel are to sit before him by rank, as determined by each man's commission in their camps and campaigns. Last, all the heads of the congregations as clans, together with their wise and knowledgeable men, shall sit before them by rank. When they gather at the communal table, having set out bread and wine, so the communal table is set for eating and wine poured for drinking, none may reach for the first portion of the bread or the wine before the priest, for he shall bless the first portion of the bread and the wine, reaching for the bread first. Afterward the Messiah of Israel shall reach for the bread. Finally, each member of the whole congregation of the Yahad shall give a blessing, in descending order of rank. This procedure shall govern every meal, provided at least 10 men are gathered together. Further examples are in the priestly blessings for the last days, the war scroll, the thanksgiving hymns, the commentaries on Isaiah, the last days, the collection of messianic proof texts, the vision of the Son of God, the commentaries on Genesis, the war of the Messiah, the inheritance of the firstborn, the Messiah of David, the redemption and resurrection, and finally the birth of the chosen one. All of these include Old Testament texts that are later applied to Jesus in the New Testament. This warrior Messiah in these Qumran texts was the dominant view, also in other Second Temple texts. For example, in this 1st century BC text we read, quote, "See, O Lord, and raise up their king for them, a son of David, for the proper time that you see, God, to rule over Israel your servant, and undergird him with strength to shatter unrighteous rulers. Cleanse Jerusalem from the nations that trample it in destruction, to expel sinners from the inheritance in wisdom and righteousness, to rub out the arrogance of the sinner like a potter's vessel, to crush all their support with an iron rod, to destroy lawless nations by the word of his mouth, for Gentiles to flee from his face at his threat, and to reprove sinners by the word of their heart. And he will gather a holy people whom he will lead in righteousness, and he will judge tribes of the people sanctified by the Lord its God. And he will no longer permit injustice to dwell among them, and no person who sees wickedness will dwell with them. For he will know them, because all of them are sons of God, and he will divide them among their tribes upon the earth. And no longer will an expatriate or foreigner dwell among them. He will judge peoples and nations by the wisdom of his righteousness." Vermes says, "To conclude, ancient Jewish prayer and Bible interpretation demonstrate unequivocally that if in the intertestamental era a man claimed or was proclaimed to be quote-unquote the Messiah, his listeners would, as a matter of course, have assumed that he was referring to the Davidic Redeemer, and would have expected to find before them a person endowed with the combined talents of soldierly prowess, righteousness, and holiness. Thus, in the same way the warrior David of old had rescued them from their pagan enemies, this eschatological warrior Messiah figure would violently remove the boot of the Roman Empire from Israel's neck, and rule over God's kingdom from Jerusalem. This was the kind of expectation that many of Jesus' disciples had. For example, James and John asked Jesus to sit at his right and at his left, in a physical kingdom in Jerusalem. Judas betrayed Jesus in order to force his hand against Rome, and Peter was increasingly vexed every time Jesus predicted his coming execution. Even John the Baptist had such a messianic expectation, leading him to momentarily doubt whether Jesus was the warrior Messiah and sending his disciples to ask him, quote, "Are you the coming one, or should we wait for someone else?" Clearly, many of the things Jesus was doing and teaching during his public ministry defied the messianic expectations of the day. Why? Because then he was crucified. In other words, there could be no greater death blow to the Jewish messianic movement than crucifixion. Wright says, quote, "The problem is, of course, that the varied pictures of a coming anointed one in the varied Judaisms of the time do not conform to what Jesus did and said. still less to what happened to him. I have, again, set these out elsewhere and can here simply summarize. Insofar as we can generalize about such complex things, three interrelated themes emerge, stretched variously in different sources. The Messiah was supposed to win the decisive victory over the pagans, to rebuild or cleanse the temple, and in some way or other to bring true God-given justice and peace to the whole world. What nobody expected the Messiah to do was to die at the hands of the pagans instead of defeating them, to mount a symbolic attack on the temple, warning it of imminent judgment instead of rebuilding it or cleansing it, and to suffer unjust violence at the hands of the pagans instead of bringing them justice and peace. The crucifixion of Jesus, understood from the point of view of any onlooker, whether sympathetic or not, was bound to have appeared as the complete destruction of any messianic pretensions or possibilities he or his followers might have hinted at. The violent execution of a prophet, which uncontroversially was how Jesus was regarded by many, still more of a would-be Messiah, did not say to any Jewish onlooker that he really was the Messiah after all, or that Yahweh's kingdom had come through his work. It is said, powerfully and irresistibly, that he wasn't and that it hadn't. We know this because we can compare Jesus and his movement to a dozen or so failed Jewish Messianic types movements of his day. Jesus was seen as a pseudo-Messiah because he was crucified with his crime inscribed on a titulus and nailed to the cross above his head. It read, quote, "The King of the Jews." The historicity of this inscription of Jesus' crime is another bedrock fact from the Gospels, and it demonstrates that Jesus was seen by the Romans as just another failed messianic pretender. Fitzmyer says, quote, "The inscription on the cross is the only thing we know of which was written about Jesus during his lifetime. Anything else that might have been written about him has disappeared. Yet, as Luke says later on in the story, this was not done in a corner. Even so, only the inscription on the cross has come down to us from Jesus' lifetime, but in 4 different forms. The King of the Jews, this is the King of the Jews, this is Jesus the King of the Jews, Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews, written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. Despite the variance, the substance of the title is present in each case. If verse 34 was originally part of the Lucan Gospel, it would add still another dimension to the scene. Jesus crucified, praying for his executioners, begging his Father for mercy toward them, and excusing their deed because of their ignorance. In the spirit of his own teaching, Jesus at this supreme moment communes with the Father and asks for pardon for what is done to him. Wright adds, quote, "On the other hand, we know that when Jesus was finally executed, the charge against him was that he was a messianic claimant. The title on the cross, whose historicity used to be challenged from time to time, is now generally accepted as historical. Even without it, the crucifixion itself points us to the charge that Jesus was a revolutionary, an insurgent, like the 2 brigands crucified with him. The mocking of Jesus fits exactly. The royal robe, the crown of thorns, the reed instead of the scepter, speaks symbolically of a messianic charge. The explicit taunts of the crowd make sense within this picture, bringing together once more the temple riddles and the messianic claim. Merely threatening the temple might not have been enough to have Jesus executed. The Essenes had been opposed to the temple for many years, and a strange prophet called Jesus, son of Ananias, who proclaimed woe against the city during the war, was beaten but not killed. Only a charge of leading a messianic movement will explain the scenario, which is the more remarkable when we remind ourselves that the earliest Christians did not follow the pattern of popular messianic movements. That is, they did not mount a military revolt against Rome. There can be no doubt, historically speaking, that Jesus was executed as a messianic pretender. The historian is therefore faced with the question, by what steps did matters proceed from Jesus' messianic acts and words in Jerusalem to his messianic death? The Gospel accounts offer us what is, after all, a relatively straightforward three-step explanation. The Romans saw Jesus as a would-be Messiah, and hence a threat to Caesar's good order. They saw him thus because the Jewish authorities laid this accusation against him. The Jewish authorities made the accusation because Jesus had first acted like a Messiah, and then confessed to the charge. The essential simplicity of this sequence of events, its accounting for the data, and the light it sheds in both directions, backwards to Jesus' earlier actions and forwards not only to the crucifixion but to the nature of early Christianity, suggests that as historians we should abandon it only if we find another scheme which does these jobs even better. So far as I'm aware, none which achieves this result has been proposed. But how do we know that these other messianic movements died with their founders? Luke records that Rabbi Gamaliel said, quote, "Fellow Israelis, consider carefully what you propose to do to these men. From the recent past, Theudas appeared, claiming that he was important, and about 400 men joined him. He was killed, and all his followers were dispersed and disappeared. After that man, at the time of the census, Judas the Galilean appeared and got people to follow him. He too died, and all his followers were scattered. I'm telling you to keep away from these men, for now. Leave them alone, because if this plan of movement is of human origin, it will fail. However, if it is from God, you won't be able to stop them, and you may even discover that you are fighting against God." Is this historically valid? Yes. We know of at least a dozen other messianic-type movements between 40 BC and 135 AD that all come to an abrupt end after their leader died or disappeared. The leaders of these movements that bear the most resemblance to Jesus are, first, Judas the Galilean in 6 AD, second, the Samaritan in 36 AD, third, Theudas in 45 AD, fourth, Jesus, son of Ananus, in the 60s AD, fifth, Menahem, son of Judas the Galilean, in 66 AD, sixth, Simon bar Giora in 70 AD, and seventh, Simon bar Kokhba in 132 to 135 AD. Some of these revolutionary figures, for example, Theudas, claimed to be prophets. Others claimed to be kings, which in those cases was probably a messianic claim. Josephus tells us that anyone with a group of followers at this time might, quote, make himself king. All of them made grand promises concerning the future, gathered disciples around themselves, and eventually had a bloody showdown with Rome. After a Roman general came out and crushed them, these leaders were beheaded, such as Theudas, crucified, such as Judas the Galilean's sons, James and Simon, or otherwise executed, and the movement they led came to a disastrous end. The followers who survived either looked for another messianic figure to follow, or were settled down and told to get a real job. In a strikingly similar example to Jesus, Simon bar Giora, in 70 AD, was executed by the general Titus in Rome. 40 years after Jesus' crucifixion under Pontius Pilate in Jerusalem, Simon had a large number of disciples he led like a king. Once captured, he was paraded through the crowds in Rome to celebrate Titus's magnificent triumph. Today in Rome, you can still see a snapshot of this victorious celebration inscribed on the Arch of Titus at the east end of the Forum. Simon bar Giora is among those Jewish prisoners pictured being led to their inevitable deaths, along with the last known visual of the menorah from the temple in Jerusalem. Simon was scourged with whips along the way and then executed before cheering crowds. This so-called Jewish Messiah was dead, and Rome rejoiced. Thus, for Simon Bar Giora, as in the case of all other messianic pretenders that had come before, the movement he led came to an end with his death. Wright says, quote, Roman victory, Roman justice, Roman empire, Roman peace, all because the Jewish leader had been killed. An interesting parallel to the Christian claim that salvation had come to the world because of the death of the Messiah. But we will let that pass for the moment. Instead, as our immediate task, imagine 2 or 3 of Simon's supporters, if there were any of them left, hiding in caves or secret cellars a few days later. Supposing one said to another, "Actually, I think Simon really was the Messiah." The kindest view the others might take would be that the speaker had gone mad. Alternatively, the statement might be understood as heavily ironic. He really was our Messiah. In other words, our God has forgotten us. This is the best we can expect. We may as well admit there is no more hope. But if the case were pressed, Simon really was a Messiah, so we should now launch a movement which hails him as such, which declares to our fellow Jews that Yahweh's anointed has been in their midst and has established the kingdom, at the very moment when Caesar's kingdom seems more firmly established than ever, and which may then go out into the world to declare that Simon, as the King of the Jews, is really the Lord of the whole world, then the verdict of madness, of a kind of criminal lunacy, which turns reality upside down and inside out, seems inevitable. And if, to anticipate the sort of theory we shall discuss later, the speaker, realizing his companions' horror at his proposal, were to explain it all by saying that he had received a vision of Simon being with him, that he had a strong sense that Israel's God had forgiven them for their failure to support him properly, that he had enjoyed a wonderful and heartwarming spiritual experience as he thought about the death of Simon, then his companions would have shaken their heads sorrowfully. None of this would remotely mean that Simon was the Messiah after all. None of it would mean that the long-awaited kingdom of Israel's God had come. None of it would mean, either, that Simon had been, quote, raised from the dead. Wright's observation here is important. Even if they claimed they had received visions of Simon, or had a heartwarming spiritual experience, none of this would have made any of them think that Simon had risen from the dead, let alone was the Messiah or the Lord of the universe. Thus, knowing that this is what usually happened, Rabbi Gamaliel compares 2 of these leaders of Messianic movements, Judas and Theudas, to Jesus of Nazareth. He argues that since their movements came to nothing after these leaders died, so too this young rising movement of the Nazarenes will also soon fail. But he adds, if this movement of the Nazarenes is from God, then it will prove to be indestructible. Notice that he spoke better than he knew, because the Jesus movement, the Nazarenes, not only continued despite his execution by Rome, but for the next 300 years, from the crucifixion of Jesus in 33 AD to Constantine's conversion to Christianity and his famous Edict of Milan in 313 AD, expanded and conquered the Roman Empire, not with armies, but with love and sacrifice. This was a direct fulfillment of Jesus' parables about the seeds, that the kingdom of God is like a man who scatters seed on the ground. Then the man goes about his daily life without intervening in the germination of the seed and the growth of the plants. That the seeds sprout and grow is explained with 4 expressions. First, it grows both night and day, that is, without interruption. Second, it grows if he sleeps and gets up, which is independently of his actions. Third, it grows but he doesn't know how. In other words, only God is truly omniscient. Fourth, it grows all by itself without visible cause, and without the farmer handling and manipulating the stalk, which is the early grass-like stages of the grain, or the head, which is the fruiting spike of the grain, or the full grain in the head, which is the fully ripened grain. Thus, when the grain is ripe, the man starts cutting with his sickle, and he harvests that grain because the harvest time has come. This is clearly a reference to God's kingdom, alerting the listeners of Jesus to the symbolism of the man who scatters seeds. In other words, God has initiated the coming of his kingdom, and Jesus proclaims God's kingdom. Thus, the man who scatters seeds represents the missionary activity of the 12 and other followers of Jesus. It emphasizes the way the seeds grow, not only during the day when the farmer is active, but also automatically by night when he sleeps. Thus, the way this parable depicts the growth of the seed underscores the reality of the presence of God's kingdom despite its hidden nature, unrecognized by the Jewish leaders and the family of Jesus, as well as the certainty of future consummation when people will see that God's kingdom comes with power. In other words, God's kingdom is a dynamic reality that has an inherent power, which will ensure its consummation. The final clause about the sickle echoes Joel 3 verse 13 and suggests that even if Jesus and his followers experience trials and suffering, the consummation of God's kingdom will bring salvation, but judgment for the enemies. Tertullian in the 2nd century nails it. Quote, "Observe how the created order has advanced little by little toward fruitfulness. First comes the grain, and from the grain arises the shoot, and from the shoot emerges the shrub, and from there the boughs and leaves gather strength, and the whole that we call a tree expands. Then follows the swelling of the germen, and from the germen bursts the flower, and from the flower the fruit opens. The fruit itself, primitive for a while, and unshapely, keeping the straight course of its development, is matured little by little to the full mellowness of its flavor. In just this way has righteousness grown in history. The proximate righteousness found in the created order is grounded in the holy God whose righteousness first emerged in a rudimentary stage as an undeveloped natural apprehension in the presence of the Holy One. Then it advanced through the law and prophets to childhood. At long last, through the gospel, God's righteousness has been personally manifested with the vital energies of youth. Now, through the Paraclete, righteousness is being manifested in its mature stage." Then Jesus provides more questions to alert the reader to expect another parable that describes what God's kingdom is like, by first comparing it to a mustard seed. The mustard seed in question is the Brassica nigra, or the black mustard, which can grow to a height of 10 feet. The seed of the mustard plant is described as the smallest of all the seeds on earth. In other words, the smallness of the mustard seed was proverbial. It takes about 750 seeds from the black mustard to make about 1 gram. Critical scholars scoffed that Jesus needed to use horticultural precision, but they ironically ignored the deliberate hyperbolic precision that Jesus utilizes for his cultural world's use of language. In other words, it would be ludicrous for us to expect Jesus to use 21st century lingo and clarify to 1st century hearers that the mustard seed ranks in the upper 1/10 of 1% of smallness in seed sizes. This is why Jesus then describes it hyperbolic growth by asserting it becoming larger than all the garden plants, with reference to large branches on which birds can nest, making this mustard shrub to stand out among the garden plants. It is to emphasize the difference between insignificant beginnings and the impressively large end result. The reference to large branches alludes to the imagery of impressive empires, indicating the future inclusion of Gentile nations in God's kingdom. The ministry of Jesus in Galilee, however, unimpressive its impact on Jewish society and however insignificant its political scope, will prove to be of ultimate far-reaching significance. Daniel's context is about the magnificent tree of Nebuchadnezzar's dream that reached to the heavens, and the birds of the air nested in its branches. Ezekiel's context is about the Davidic dynasty and the Egyptian empire, both featuring towering cedars, where birds live in the shade and make nests in the sprawling branches. These birds are great nations that benefit from Egypt's wealth and protection. The birds of Nebuchadnezzar's dream are also a transparent symbol for Gentile nations, and Daniel says that, quote, "Your dominion reaches to the distant parts of the earth." Thus, Jesus incorporates similar imagery into his mustard seed parable by showing that, despite its humble and unpretentious beginnings, God's kingdom will achieve spectacular growth. Whether the imagery of the nesting birds simply indicates the size of the tree or whether it symbolizes specific nations, the background of sprawling bird havens in the Old Testament reinforces the imperial pretensions of God's kingdom, which will take the place of the human empires of Old Testament times. In the first century, God's kingdom did not look very impressive, and some question whether it existed at all. In fact, it appeared to look like a defeated, powerless, ragtag group of followers. But what is real is not always obvious. What began in the Galilean ministry of Jesus will, by the power of God, one day prove to be of ultimate significance. Though its power was hidden, it is not for that reason any less certain, and its growth will be spectacular as first demonstrated at Pentecost. The mustard seed that is planted through the ministry of Jesus will one day be in full, glorious foliage, and the dominion, glory, and eternal kingship of Jesus will be evident to all, because it will be ruled by a gentle and generous king. Unlike the short-lived kingdoms of many human kings, the kingdom of Jesus will have no end. The expectation of such a future kingdom is especially good news to the powerless, the oppressed, and the persecuted, living under human political structures that pervert kingdom values. Peter Chrysologus, 4th century Latin Archbishop of Ravenna, concludes, quote, "It is up to us to sow this mustard seed in our minds, and let it grow within us into a great tree of understanding reaching up to heaven and elevating all our faculties. Then it will spread out branches of knowledge. The pungent savour of its fruit will make our mouths burn. Its fiery kernel will kindle a blaze within us, inflaming our hearts, and the taste of it will dispel our unenlightened repugnance." Yes, it is true. A mustard seed is indeed an image of the kingdom of God. Christ is the kingdom of heaven. Sown like a mustard seed in the garden of the Virgin's womb, he grew up into the tree of the cross, whose branches stretch across the world. Crushed in the mortar of the Passion, its fruit has produced seasoning enough for the flavoring and preservation of every living creature with which it comes in contact. As long as a mustard seed remains intact, its properties lie dormant, but when it is crushed, they are exceedingly evident. So it was with Christ. He chose to have his body crushed, because he would not have his power concealed. Christ became all things in order to restore all of us in himself. The man Christ received the mustard seed, which represents the kingdom of God. As man he received it, though as God he had always possessed it. He sowed it in his garden, that is, in his bride, the church. The church is a garden extending over the whole world, tilled by the plough of the gospel, fenced in by stakes of doctrine and discipline, cleared of every harmful weed by the labor of the apostles, fragrant and lovely with perennial flowers, virgins as lilies and martyrs as roses set amid the pleasant verdure of all who bear witness to Christ, and the tender plants of all who have faith in him. Such then is the mustard seed which Christ sowed in his garden. When he promised the kingdom to the patriarchs, the seed took root in them. With the prophets it sprang up, with the apostles it grew tall. In the church it became a great tree, putting forth innumerable branches laden with gifts. And now you too must take the wings of the psalmist's dove, gleaming gold in the rays of divine sunlight, and fly to rest forever among those sturdy, fruitful branches. No snares are set to trap you there. Fly off, then, with confidence, and dwell securely in its shelter. Wright affirms, quote, "It is clear that nothing had occurred which would make them think that Israel had suddenly become the ruler of the world. No event had happened on the social, political, or military stage to make them think that at last the long night of pagan oppression had come to an end. If we bracket off the resurrection itself, the only other recent event of significance had been the execution of yet another apparent messianic pretender. That was a common enough phenomenon. It communicated to the Jews not that the kingdom had come, but that it clearly had not. It will not do to say, as many have done, that the disciples had a wonderful inner experience and sense of the love and grace and forgiveness of God. This was the argument used by the Dutch theologian Edward Schellebecks in his huge book on Jesus. Jews quite often experience God's love and grace in new, fresh, and illuminating ways, not least after passing through times of crisis and pain. They had several well-developed ways of talking about this sort of experience. There is no evidence whatsoever that they would use quote-unquote resurrection language in such a situation. Especially, there is no evidence that, faced with the catastrophic destruction of their hopes in the death of a would-be leader or Messiah, Jews who found their hearts once more strangely warmed by a sense of the love of Israel's God would say of this person that he had been raised from the dead. It will not do, therefore, to say that Jesus' disciples were so stunned and shocked by his death, so unable to come to terms with it, that they projected their shattered hopes onto the screen of fantasy and invented the idea of Jesus' resurrection as a way of coping with a cruelly broken dream. That has an initial apparent psychological plausibility, but it won't work as a serious first-century history. We know of lots of other messianic and similar movements in the Jewish world roughly contemporary with Jesus. In many cases, the leader died a violent death at the hands of the authorities. In not one single case do we hear the slightest mention of the disappointed followers claiming that their hero had been raised from the dead. They knew better. Resurrection was not a private event. It involved human bodies. There would have to be an empty tomb somewhere. A Jewish revolutionary whose leader had been executed by the authorities and who managed to escape arrest himself had two options: give up the revolution or find another leader. We have evidence of people doing both. Claiming that the original leader was alive again was simply not an option. Unless, of course, he was. Thus, to summarize the unparalleled innovative claims of the Nazarenes, we must ask, what made them respond to the death of their Messiah differently from anyone else before or since? Could it be the reason they, in unparalleled fashion, claimed the leader Jesus was alive again was that he actually was? The first pure innovation we find from the early Christians is their positive interpretation of a crucified Messiah. We do not possess another example of a positive view of crucifixion and or the person crucified from the ancient world. Hengel says, quote, "There remains the question whether there is any evidence in the ancient Roman world for a non-Christian positive interpretation of death by crucifixion, say as the manner of death of a philosopher or a national martyr. After all, the death of such figures was a familiar feature in the ancient world. I have not been able to discover a real historical instance." As Cicero famously said, quote, "To put a Roman citizen to death is like murdering your own father. To crucify him? What?" Thus, if there are no words to describe the crucifixion of a Roman citizen, how do we describe the crucifixion of God's Messiah? This is why Paul the Pharisee rejected Jesus, because his crucifixion proved he was under God's curse. This was no doubt the same thing Jesus' disciples thought on the evening of Good Friday. Even if they still loved him and wept for him, Jesus' death meant he could not be God's Messiah. The testimony of one of Jesus' disciples on the Emmaus Road captures this thinking well. Quote, "On the same day, 2 of Jesus' followers were walking to a village called Emmaus, about 60 stadia from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about all these things that had taken place. While they were discussing and analyzing what had happened, Jesus himself approached and began to walk with them. But their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. He asked them, 'What are you discussing with each other as you're walking along?' They stood still and looked gloomy. The one whose name was Cleopas answered him, 'Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who doesn't know what happened there in the past few days?' He asked them, 'What things?'
You serious?
They answered him, 'The events involving Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in what he said and did before God and all the people, and how our high priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and had him crucified. But we kept hoping that he would be the one to redeem Israel. What is more, this is now the 3rd day since these things occurred.' Notice how their hopes and dreams concerning Jesus had been shattered due to his crucifixion. This mindset fits with everything we know about how ancient peoples viewed crucifixion, and Jews especially, in light of the dozen or so failed messianic movements. And yet Paul says within roughly 20 years of Jesus' crucifixion, quote, 'For while I was with you, I resolved to know nothing except Jesus Messiah and him crucified.' Why? Because the cross of Jesus became God's power and God's wisdom. Thus, this is extraordinary, and the historian should be pressed for an explanation. In fact, notice the added odd claim that this crucified Messiah had risen from the dead. Nowhere else do we find the claim of a 2-stage resurrection, in which the Messiah would rise from the dead and then everyone else at a later still future resurrection. In other words, any Jewish belief in a resurrection was always in the future. There was no expectation for a single person to be resurrected in the middle of human history. Christopher Evans says, "It may be suggested that only this event, whatever it may have been, could have brought it about that there emerged in Christianity a precise, confident, and articulate faith in which resurrection has moved from the circumference to the center. Thus, it is not enough to attempt to explain the Christian belief that Jesus had risen from the dead by claiming that many Jews believed in resurrection." William Lane Craig says, quote, "Crossan's insistence that the Jewish mind had to express Jesus' victory over death by resurrection language is simply inaccurate, for we know of several other models current in Judaism that might have been employed. On the contrary, since there was no expectation of an isolated resurrection within history, the choice of the category of resurrection must be explained. Thus, how did resurrection become the central belief of the early Christians? Moreover, where did they get this idea of a 2-stage resurrection, and why did they claim this happened to the crucified man Jesus? Why did they not say Jesus was translated to heaven like Enoch, or Elijah, or Job's children, or the 2 witnesses? There were many categories of exalted saints like Ezra and Baruch, and martyred heroes of the past that could have been applied to Jesus. Dale Allison says, quote, "Even if, however, we accept Ludman's suppositions, we're still left with the question why a hallucination led a first-century Jew to confess that Jesus had been, quote, raised from the dead. Half of the Jewish texts from 200 BC to 200 CE that speak of an afterlife do so without mentioning the resurrection, and there was no single idea about life after death in our period, but instead a variety. Immortality of the soul or something akin to it is found as often as not. It would have been easy enough for Peter and those who welcomed his testimony to declare that God had vindicated and exalted Jesus without using the concept of the eschatological resurrection. If, as Ludemann contends, the first community knew nothing about an open tomb, Peter and his fellow believers could have said, in a manner reminiscent of Jubilees 23:31, that while Jesus' bones rested for now in the earth, his spirit was exalted in heaven. Or they could have spoken about Jesus the way the Testament of Job, without using the language of resurrection, speaks about its hero. Job's soul was taken to heaven immediately after his death, while his body was prepared for burial. This is not, however, what our sources report. I find no clear evidence that any Jews believed that the resurrection of martyrs would follow immediately upon their death. The Maccabean martyrs were believed to have gained eternal life after death, but the general bodily resurrection was still future. None of these figures, until Jesus, were ever claimed to be raised from the dead. Resurrection was consistently seen as a future event. It would happen to all the saints and martyrs, but in the renewed creation. It was the earliest Christians who, with pure innovation, brought these ideas of crucifixion, resurrection, and the Messiah together. James Dunn summarizes, quote, "In short, the three most primitive characteristics of the appearances prior to Paul are a visionary seeing, an element of, and a sense of obligation to make the vision known. Not all three are present by any means in all resurrection appearances, and they occur in different combinations. But in every case on record, the consequent conviction is firm and sure. Jesus is risen. He appeared to me, or us." Having drawn attention to the ambiguity of the appearances for some at least of the first disciples, it is perhaps necessary to say one word more. As in the case of Paul, it is possible that subjective and psychological factors played an even larger role than I have allowed, that the appearances were indeed all in the mind from start to finish. The ambiguity suggested by the records is part of the wider ambiguity of religious experience to which we referred earlier, so that the possibility of self-delusion and mass hallucination cannot be ruled out. Nevertheless, I must confess that the weight of probability seems to me to tilt the scales in the other direction. Quite apart from such other matters as the empty tomb, the degree of independence of several at least of the experiences, Peter, James, and Paul, and the divine significance so quickly attributed by monotheistic Jews to one of their fellows, it remains an indisputable fact that the earliest believers, including the initial doubters, no less than Paul, were absolutely convinced that they had seen Jesus risen from the dead. And yet, why should they assume that what they saw was Jesus? Why not an angel? And why did they conclude that it was Jesus risen from the dead? Why not simply a vision of the dead man? Why not visions fleshed out with the apparatus of apocalyptic expectation, coming on clouds of glory and the like? Why draw the astonishing conclusion that the eschatological resurrection had already taken place in the case of a single individual quite separate from and prior to the general resurrection? There must have been something very compelling about the appearances for such an extravagant, not to say ridiculous, and outrageous conclusion to be drawn. For myself, the most satisfactory explanation is that it was Jesus whom they saw, Jesus alive from the dead, making himself known to them in a mode of existence which transcended the limitations of time and space. All of this finally leads to the fact that this crucified Messiah, whom God raised from the dead, was also divine and God of the universe. This is the most shocking of them all, especially in the Jewish monotheistic context from which this idea arose. No one expected the Messiah to be crucified and resurrected, but neither did anyone expect the Messiah to be Yahweh, as Paul affirms, quote, "In God's own form existed he, and shared with God equality, deemed nothing needed grasping." Also, quote, "To the Israelis belong the patriarchs, and from them the Messiah descended, who is God over all, the one who is forever blessed. Amen." Thus, Jesus is presented as pre-existing, involved in the creation of the universe, being worshipped and prayed to, sharing in God's unique identity and sovereignty by being called Lord and God. In fact, Paul is quoting another early tradition or hymn that he received when he says, quote, "For even if there are gods in heaven and on earth, as indeed there are many so-called gods and lords, yet for us there is only one God, the Father, from whom everything came into being, and for whom we live, and there is only one Lord, Jesus, the Messiah, through whom everything came into being, and through whom we live." Ehrman says, quote, "This verse may well incorporate another pre-Pauline creed of some kind, as it divides itself neatly, as can be seen, into two parts, with 2 lines each. The first part is a confession of God the Father, and the second a confession of Jesus Christ. It is through Christ that all things come into being, and that believers themselves exist. This sounds very much like what non-Christian Jewish texts occasionally say about God's wisdom. And God's wisdom was itself understood to be God, as we have seen. So too, Jesus and Paul. One of the most debated verses in the Pauline letters is Romans 9:5. Scholars dispute how the verse is to be translated. What is clear is that Paul is talking about the advantages given to the Israelites, and he indicates that the fathers, that is, the Jewish patriarchs, belong to the Israelites, and from them is the Christ, according to the flesh, the one who is God over all, blessed forever. Amen. Here, Christ is God over all. This is a very exalted view. Thus, notice that Paul is redefining the Shema, which he would have quoted at least daily as a devoted Pharisee. Quote, "Listen, Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone." These Jewish Nazarenes are still monotheists, but they began proclaiming that this crucified man Jesus shares in the unique identity with Yahweh, the one God of Israel. James Dunn says, quote, "Thus he starts from the common ground of the basic monotheistic faith. There is one God, the Father. First he adds, from whom came all things, an assertion with which the Corinthians would have been familiar and with which they would no doubt have agreed. But then he also adds, and we to him, or for whom we exist. Next he appends to this the basic confession of Hellenistic or Gentile Christianity. Jesus Christ is Lord. But with this he does 3 striking things. First, he asserts that Christ the Lord also is one. Thereby he splits the Shema, the Jewish confession of monotheism, between God the Father and Christ the Lord in a way that has no earlier parallel. Second, he adds, through whom came all things. Thereby he splits the more regular Stoic formulation, also between the one God, from him to him, and the one Lord, which is through him, in a way that is best paralleled in Jewish wisdom tradition. Third, he again adds a reference to himself and his readers, and we exist through him, using the same preposition as in the preceding phrase. Why has Paul handled these basic assertions of Jewish monotheism and Stoic cosmology in such a free manner? The most obvious answer is that he wishes to stress the unity of creation and salvation to prevent a split in the Corinthians' thinking between their experience of spiritual power and their attitude to the material world. Hence, the insistence, in effect, that the one Lord of believers is not separable from the one God, the Creator. The Lord through whom salvation comes is the Lord through whom all things come. Salvation for us means that we live for the one God from whom all things and through the one Lord in the way that all things come about through the one Lord. In other words, the spiritual experience of the Corinthians, we through him, is not to be separated from responsibility to the Creator God, we to him, and his experience of one and the same power, which brought all things to be, all things through him. Hengel also says, quote, "This creed is notable because of its strict parallelism and is theologically interesting because here apparently for the first time Christ is described as the one who mediates creation. Does it come from a song that was sung in Corinth, or from a baptismal creed, or did Paul formulate it in hymnic prose just for the occasion? We have a number of similar Christian and Jewish hagios formulas. Their ultimate origin is the Shema, prayer of Judaism. The Pauline formula is, however, notable in that the confession to Christ is made strictly parallel to the confession to God, and beyond that is integrated into it. The binary formula is the first step on the way to the doctrine of the Trinity. This chart demonstrates the radical mutation within Paul's strict monotheism, where you're tracing Jesus to Yahweh. So notice you have from Hebrew to Greek to English. So you have Yahweh, which is God's personal name in the Old Testament, that leads to Kurios, which is the title used to translate Yahweh into Greek and most commonly applied to Jesus, and that leads to the English word Lord, the English title almost always applied to Jesus in the New Testament. Then you have Elohim, which is the title for God in the Old Testament, that leads to the Greek Theos, the title used to translate Elohim into Greek, and most commonly applied to God the Father, which then becomes God, the English title almost always applied to God the Father in the New Testament. But then you have the Shema, so Shema Yisrael, Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad, that becomes the Shema redefined. So notice you have the words Theos and Kurios interchange between Pater and Jesus Christos. So that then leads to, in 1 Corinthians 8, yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom all things and from whom we exist, and one Lord, Jesus. So in this case, what we're seeing here is a type of two-power binitarian theology that Paul is recounting with respect to Jesus and the Father. Larry Hurtado says, quote, "But although a number of the specific ways that Jesus is characterized in early Christian writings have interesting similarities and parallels in the references to these principal agent figures, there is a crucial difference that makes them all fall considerably short of serving as an adequate full analogy for the place held by Jesus in early Christian circles. None of the principal agents figures in the relevant Jewish text functions in the way that Jesus does in the devotional practice of earliest Christians. More specifically, as I've argued elsewhere and shall illustrate later in this discussion, in early Christian circles, Jesus is recipient of the sorts of expressions of devotion that are otherwise reserved for God alone, and which simply have no analogy in Jewish tradition of the Second Temple period. Put simply, this worship of the risen exalted Jesus comprises a radical new innovation in Jewish monotheistic religion. Thus, how does the historian account for this radical new innovation within first century Jewish monotheism? How is it possible that within roughly 20 years of Jesus' crucifixion, he was already being worshipped and presented as participating in the unique divine sovereignty of Yahweh, the God of Israel? Hengel pointedly says, quote, "Such skepticism, which thrusts aside the unanimous accounts of the evangelists, comes at a high price. We can no longer satisfactorily explain the rise of Christology among Jesus' followers, who banded together at Easter. An appeal to the resurrection event does not solve anything. Not only is the question of what actually happened after Good Friday a matter of scholarly dispute, but also, more significantly for our purposes and conveniently overlooked, there is no religio-historical connection between the notion of the resurrection of who has died and that one's ascendancy to a messianic status. The Easter appearances alone do not suffice as an explanation for why the crucified one came to be recognized as the Messiah, Son of God, and Lord. In other words, the earliest confessions of Jesus' divinity could not be due only to the belief in his resurrection. Even if his followers believed Jesus rose from the dead, why would monotheistic Jews worship and pray to him and say that Jesus participated in the creation of the world and shares in the identity and sovereignty of Yahweh, the God of Israel? Along with their belief in the resurrection, the historical Jesus must have made claims concerning his divinity during his public ministry. In conclusion, a coming Messiah, resurrection, and monotheism were all concepts known in the ancient Jewish and Greco-Roman world. Yet no one mutated them and put them together the way the early Christians did concerning Jesus. They uniquely, with unparalleled innovation, proclaimed that the crucified man Jesus was the Messiah, whom God raised from the dead, and was also God of the universe. These ideas arose within a monotheistic Jewish context, and over a period of fewer than roughly 20 years after Jesus' crucifixion. This presses the historian for an explanation. Why did the early Christians begin to view Jesus' crucifixion in a positive manner? Why did they say Jesus rose from the dead as the first stage of a two-stage resurrection event? Done us. So our question returns with added force. Why was the first articulation of post-Easter faith in just these terms, quote-unquote, resurrection, the beginning of the resurrection of the dead? Why did these monotheistic Jews, such as Paul, claim that Jesus was divine, pray to him, and worship him, even claiming he shared in the unique identity and sovereignty of Yahweh, the God of Israel? Who did this threefold innovation originate with? Peter, Mary Magdalene, James, an unknown follower? If Jesus remained dead, the historian must ask how it was that these innovations were created ex nihilo. On the other hand, if Jesus burst through all the contemporary expectations of messiahship and resurrection and really did rise from the dead, then this was the unparalleled event in history that led to such unparalleled claims. Why? Because it was a genuine eucatastrophe. Jesus' resurrection was the most unexpected and radically new innovation that the world had ever seen. Thus, the earliest followers of Jesus were attempting to explain not just an extraordinary event, but rather a vivid, haunting event. They could not fully grasp all of its implications, but what they could not deny was that Jesus being resurrected meant the beginning of a new creation, a new chapter in cosmic history. The repeated phrase in the creedal tradition, quote, "He appeared," is the next key to unlocking the origins of these extraordinary innovations.